"You wouldn't think," said Mrs. Brown, looking hard at her husband, "that it would be possible to get lost in such a short space of time. We've only been in France half a day." "Are you sure you don't know where we are, Paddington?" asked Mr. Brown for the umpteenth time. Paddington shook his head sadly. "I think we must have taken the wrong turning by mistake, Mr. Brown," he admitted. The Browns looked gloomily at one another. Until that moment, their first day in France had been jolly and exciting. With so many new things to see, the time had passed very quickly, and Paddington, in particular, had been kept busy following the route with his paw and making notes as they went along. On the journey along the coast, they had passed through a number of towns, and he'd been most impressed by the sight of all the bustling traffic on the wrong side of the road and the people sitting at tables on the pavement outside cafes. Between the towns, they had driven along miles of straight country roads lined on either side by tall poplar trees and past tiny villages full of men in blue overalls and women hurrying to and fro, carrying long loaves of bread. Nicest of all, every now and then, as they turned a corner, they had had a glimpse of the blue sea and heard the distant roar of waves breaking on the shore. And then, as they crossed into Brittany, not only had the countryside gradually become much wilder, but things had started to go wrong as well. First, the wide black road had suddenly changed into a narrow lane covered in stones. Then the lane had become a cart track. Finally, the cart track had come to an end on a piece of common land, and as a final blow, the car had punctured one of its back tyres. Being in charge of the itinerary, Paddington felt very upset at what had happened, and he peered hard at the maps while the Browns gathered anxiously around him. "What was the name of the last place we went through, Paddington?" asked Mr. Brown. "Perhaps that's where we went wrong." "I think it was called Gravelons, Mr. Brown," said Paddington, "but I can't see it on any of the maps." "Gravelons?" repeated Mr. Brown. "That's funny, I seem to remember seeing that written up somewhere too. Are you sure you can't find it?" He bent over and looked at the map while Paddington examined Mrs. Bird's old tea towel hopefully. "Crikey!" exclaimed Jonathan suddenly as he looked up from his dictionary. "No wonder you can't find it on the maps. Gravelons isn't a place, it's a road sign. It means loose chippings." "What?" exclaimed Paddington hotly. "Loose chippings?" "That's where all those stones were." "That's where all those stones were," said Judy. "They must have been repairing the road." Mrs. Bird snorted. "Gravelons indeed," she exclaimed. "No wonder that poor bear went wrong. It's a mercy we didn't end up in the sea." Mrs. Bird firmly believed that everything abroad should be written in good plain English. "Oh well," said Mr. Brown as he folded the map, "at least we know where we're not, even if we don't know where we are." He looked down at the pile of luggage which hid the spare wheel in the boot of the car. "Everything will have to come out, so I vote we make the best of it and have a picnic while I change the wheel." Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird, who had been looking forward to having a rest and a nice meal in a comfortable hotel, didn't look very pleased at the idea, but Jonathan, Judy and Paddington were most excited. Paddington, in particular, thought it was a very good idea of Mr. Brown's. He liked picnics, and it was a long time since he'd had one. "It's a good thing I brought some food along," said Mrs. Bird as she opened her travelling bag and began to take out an assortment of tins and packets, together with a loaf of bread and some knives and forks. "I had a feeling we might need it." "I'll tell you what," said Mr. Brown, "we'll have a competition. You can each cook one of the courses and I'll give a prize for the best one." Mr. Brown was very keen on competitions. He had a vague idea that it kept people out of mischief. "Whizzo!" exclaimed Jonathan. "Bags, we have a campfire." "I'll collect some firewood if you like, Mr. Brown," said Paddington, waving his paw in the direction of a wood at the top of a nearby hill. "Bears are good at collecting firewood." "Don't go too far," called Mrs. Brown anxiously as Paddington picked up his suitcase and hurried off. "We don't want you getting lost as well." But Paddington was already out of earshot. He was still feeling guilty that the Browns had lost their way, and he was anxious to make amends by gathering as much firewood as possible. So he hurried up the hill as fast as his little legs could carry him. But looking around and sniffing the air as he made his way across the springy turf, Paddington decided that perhaps being lost wasn't such a bad thing after all.